The question is whether they soldered the heat spreader. Nope. This insane abomination from the depths of AliExpress contains a laptop CPU directly BGA soldered to an ITX motherboard with a custom heat spreader hacked together on top. And it's actually really interesting. The motherboard manufacturer is called Erying, and they made the Skyline G660 ITX CPU and motherboard combo. The board uses an i7-12700H BGA CPU, so it's a laptop CPU, and then they stick it to basically a DIY socketable motherboard. But they creatively engineered it. And most interestingly, it's about $320 on AliExpress. So although it's a laptop i7, you're getting an i7 and a board for relatively cheap. And this is another one of their products that we'll be looking at today as well. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly. Thermal Grizzly's Hydronaut and Cryonaut thermal pastes are high-performing thermal interfaces for use on CPUs and GPUs. You can bring an old card back to peak performance by repasting it and doing preventative maintenance, and Thermal Grizzly's Hydronaut is ideal for water cooling and air cooling for new and old cards alike. Cryonaut paste is one of the top performing pastes for extreme overclocking with CPUs and GPUs and has been used in several world record scoring machines. Learn more at the link in the description below. So we bought these with the intention of doing full reviews on them, which we're doing today, because they're potentially really interesting, if maybe a bit abnormal, as cheap options for a mostly DIY computer. The only part you're not DIYing is putting the CPU in the socket at that point. This idea is not brand new, but it hasn't been done quite to this level of at least outward professionalism that we're seeing here. The question is, well, there's some BIOS and driver downloads that throw malware flags that appear to be Trojans, but we'll get to that later. So there are some downsides, but the company appears to be real and actually trying to make a real product. And at $320 in keeping with the Mini-ITX form factor, that would limit you to an i5-13400F and below on the Intel side, or an R5-5600 and below on the AMD side if you go the full DIY route. And we're gonna take these apart in a moment, but here's the full spec sheet. This board has a mobile 12700H CPU. That means it has 6 P cores running to 4.7 gigahertz max and 8 E cores up to 3.5 gigahertz. There's a total of 20 threads here with hyper-threading. The base power is listed as 45 watts with a maximum turbo of 115 watts. We also got this other Polestar G613 micro ATX board that has an i9-11980HK in it. For one of them, the drivers were completely okay, and then the other one had virus scans rejecting them. Now, we're not security experts here, so we didn't decompile the files and look for if it's a false positive or a real threat. When prompted by the team, I said, you know what, let's call it off for that particular driver package for that board, and let's focus on the other board, this one, that didn't appear to be causing problems. And also, let's not put it on the network. And to be fair, that one was in the clear. So that's the one we set up, installed, tested, and benchmarked. And it's pretty interesting. But there's a thriving, really cool engineering culture behind these types of products. A brand like Erying isn't necessarily big enough to get official support or even supply from a company like Intel. We've seen this a lot. And before we dive deeper into the board, we wanted to give some cultural background on how these types of products can come to exist, because we've been to the places where they're designed and built a lot of the time, and it's pretty unique. So in a lot of instances, boards like the ones we're looking at today are scraped together through any means possible. It's possible then that the CPUs and the chipsets may have come from a salvage operation that pulled them from otherwise dead devices. We've actually seen this in person and talked about it in the past. We've been to literal back alleys in Shenzhen and Dongguan in China that have desoldering operations to retrieve perfectly good silicon from dead parts. There's a unique culture in that way of reuse of electronics in many of the Eastern countries we've been to, China, Japan, and Taiwan included. And it's impressive to see these expensive components, like chipsets, get harvested from boards that are otherwise going to a landfill. They often find their way back into unique homebrew products that fit well with a local supply and cost-sensitive market, but might not work in the West, or might not even get approval by a company like Intel. In places like Taiwan, and especially Shenzhen and Dongguan, local manufacturers often can't get supply contracts with big silicon brands due to relatively small startup size. That means that they don't get BIOS software or firmware support either. And so these teams have to hack together firmware from discarded parts. They overcome chip limitations through harvesting e-waste, which creates a contained ecosystem of relatively affordable, cool products that wouldn't ever get official approval otherwise for someone like Asus or Gigabyte. We're getting to the part where we talk about if these things are actually any good. For context though, Erying does have some other boards. They have them down to about $150, $135 actually, for Micro-ATX. That's with a 6-core 11th gen engineering sample. So a lot of these are engineering samples, which is part of what benefits the price. We didn't buy that one. It's not bad on paper, but we haven't tested it. And the best you can do for that price in retail is going to be like a board plus a dual-core Celeron or something, or maybe a really bad Pentium like a G6400. Enough of that though. It's time to overview this thing and then get into the teardown and see if it actually merits any purchasing consideration. The sizing is already comical, but it's not particularly special because it's Mini-ITX, so it's to be expected. This is an Asus, I think something in my wrist popped when I picked that up. It gives you an idea for scale on this thing. You could build a comically proportioned computer. So anyway, this thing, you'll notice this one doesn't have a chipset. That's because the 12700H is an SoC design. And SoC, or system on chip design, means that the chipset is integrated with the CPU package. It's going to be under here. This is Erying's solution to attempting to maintain roughly the same Z height that you would get on a package with a socket and a CPU in it. Because if you think about it, if they're trying to maintain some kind of compatibility for coolers as they would mount on a DIY solution, then they have to adapt the laptop component to be able to meet standard market coolers, one, without cracking the silicon underneath, and two, while actually reaching them. And so this is to maintain Z height and also get some kind of IHS for protection and for spreading that heat, or integrated heat spreader if you don't know. It's a 2-part construction. On their other one here, they put a copper slug centrally, and on the ITX one, it is all just a sort of brushed aluminum. Now for the PCIe slot, so this is a PCIe Gen 4 slot, and it appears to be by 16 in every way. It's by 16 length. If you look at the back up here, it is wired by 16, at least by presence of pins. And although we won't really be able to see it on camera, maybe in B-roll, but within the slot, it's entirely pinned as well. So it looks all like by 16, but it's not. Looking at the box, there's a part right here, actually. It tells you one PCIe Gen 4 by 16 slot, and then it says by 8 practical use. So fair enough. So for storage, there are 3 M.2 slots, which is on the upper end for what a Mini-ITX board can physically fit. There's one up here above the CPU. That's a pretty unique position. You typically see the VRM there. So that's kind of cool. On the back, exact opposite side, they've got another one, and both of these are PCIe Gen 4. Then there's one more, and that's at the bottom of the board under the CPU. So this slot is a PCIe Gen 3 slot. There are 2 additional storage options. So there's 2 SATA headers down here if you want to do a 2.5 inch or 3.5 inch drive or something. Now we're going to look at rear I/O. First thing you might notice is that we've taped the battery to the board, and it's just plugged into this small header here. So a funny story about that. As we said, this shipped from AliExpress, and they didn't want to pay whatever duties are required to ship a battery, even if it's a 2032, or maybe they don't want the customer to have it get stuck. This note came in the box. So we did actually look, and it was supposed to be hidden under here. So they actually, I don't know if it like qualifies as customs fraud or what it is exactly, but either way, the battery's supposed to be taped up under here like contraband. And believe it or not, this note, although you would think it is all code and no one could interpret it, customs did, and the battery wasn't in the box. Our assumption is that they looked at the note and they went, come on, guys, and then they took the battery. But thank you, customs, for at least forwarding the rest of the board to us. So it's got 4 I/O. There's VGA, HDMI, and DisplayPort. And we did test these, and they are actually capable of outputting to 4 displays simultaneously, which is much better than we expected. You obviously wouldn't be able to do that for like gaming or whatever. The USB support's pretty good too. So we've got 2 USB 3, 4 USB 2, and there's 2 Ethernet ports. So this is a dual LAN 2.5 gigabit per second for each one, which aligns with some of our suspicions that there may be some motivation from source materials on the networking side, which BIOS has excessive Wi-Fi detail. We'll talk about that later. So now we move on to the interesting part, which is how the whole backplate and IHS solution is assembled. The back of the board, the quirk here is that there's a pre-installed LGA 1700 backplate, and this is responsible for mounting both a cooler and, you can see here, the aluminum heat spreader. So on the front side, this is from us. They don't ship with that. These are just threaded standoffs. I think we took them from an Arctic liquid freezer too, but we installed them backwards. They're supposed to go top down, typically. We did through the back of the board, and we had to kind of engineer our own solution where we took some standoffs, also salvaged from an Arctic liquid freezer too, and we were able to get the right height to make contact. But this doesn't just fit like any cooler natively. It may take a little bit of play. It is not as easy as a socketed IHS, and that's for a few reasons, but the main one is that a pre-installed backplate for LGA 1700 is not typical. Might just be an inconsistency where you have to really play around to get this thing to work well. All right, let's do a quick disassembly here. This shouldn't be complicated. Okay, is it loose already? Yep. So those 4 are the ones that we put in there. You can see they're actually screwed in all the way. This is just a protective coating, so there's no direct shorts. The question is whether they soldered the heat spreader. Nope. They definitely didn't solder the heat spreader to the CPU. Or if they did, it would now be broken. There's actually like a serial number on there. I'm going to clean this off. But this is a mobile CPU. So if you don't follow laptop content at all, this is typically what's in a laptop without the IHS. They don't use IHSs. From an assembly standpoint, it's in a good starting spot. Erying worked on, for example, an updated heatsink design for the MOSFETs for the VRM for one of its boards. So the aftermarket heatsink was sold as an add-on, but Erying wasn't sure if it was any good. Here's how they decided to pitch it. So the listing says, for this VRM heatsink sets, we just charged the shipping cost. The package parcel is about 0.1 kilograms. We didn't earn any money. We just help our customers to find this heatsink for improving the VRM cooling. And this is not the final version. We're still improving. I hope you will not have too high expectations for this VRM heatsink. It is not the perfect one. And even though it's not perfect, it's awesome that this is the approach, because it's kind of hard to be mad at a company if they're like, this is just an R&D thing. We're not really sure if it's any good, but here it is for as cheap as we can possibly make it. Let us know what you think. But it's still a fun way to market a product, and it allows a certain level of openness to do R&D. As another example, here's the page for Erying's cheapest board plus the CPU listing. It's full of information about compatibility, stability, and even niche stuff like Hyper-V. Our favorite part is the bit about BIOS updates. They said, quote, about the BIOS update suggestions, we need to explain that. BIOS modifications is not so easy. We have much difficulty. Before we start selling this board, we need to test and adjust the BIOS over thousands of times. If changing or modifying the BIOS, it'll cause the motherboard to fail to start or many other problems. This really isn't easy. Hope you can understand. Getting to the BIOS, we had no idea what we were going to see on this thing. It's an interesting combination of a laptop CPU and a motherboard and a BIOS that was probably at least partly ripped from another device. It's a no-nonsense setup with simple graphics. It's got simply nested settings, and it really makes you realize how convoluted and bloated some modern UEFIs are from big board manufacturers these days. Uniquely, each time the user navigates sections, the icons change. Advanced is at first a star, which changes to some gears when you go to that section. Power is a gear. Wait, no, it's an IC. One of them kind of looks like a credit card, and changes also, but this happens for all of them. You get the idea. Since the 12700H is a locked CPU, the turbo menu doesn't do very much. You can set a custom core ratio between base and boost, which is normal. You're also able to set a custom set of power limits and duration, all the way up to 999 watts. We went in and checked hardware info after setting these, and yes, they applied. That doesn't actually draw more power, remember, it just raises the package power consumption limit, and in Cinebench, that means the actual change is from about 95 watts to 115. That could help boost performance in power constraint scenarios by a little bit, so it's nice to have that option. Under the advanced section, there are a ton of extremely niche wireless settings that frankly go beyond what we're knowledgeable about here. WAN configuration for 5G, Wi-Fi antenna gain per channel, you name it, everything's in there. So we have a strong suspicion that this particular BIOS started life in another device entirely, maybe some kind of network device. It wasn't all good though. We had some problems with getting memory settings to apply during testing, and it seems like even small stumbles would cause the BIOS to reset to defaults entirely. We don't know how large the Erying BIOS team is, but these are the types of difficulties they were describing in the marketing text. So they're frustrating, but they're disclaimed, which makes it hard to be too mad at it. We did willingly buy the product when it disclaimed those things. Now we're gonna do some benchmarks. So the main point of this video is not to do a deep dive on the specific performance of the Erying boards. It was more of just are these things even viable, or are they just kind of weird and cool? Certainly they're weird and cool. You can kind of just look at the IHS for that. But as for the viable part, the answer is sort of. We ran these through our full standard CPU test suite in gaming and productions. So when testing CPUs that use DDR4, we typically use Gear 1 mode on the integrated memory controller, driving 4 8GB sticks of 3200 CL14 memory with manually controlled subtimings. But the Erying board with the 12700H wasn't able to boot with Gear 1 and with those timings and with that RAM at all, really. So we had to step it back. We dropped it to Gear 2, and we would guess that this has to come from some combination of the mobile IMC being different and of limitations of the BIOS or just stability of the platform in general. It's 3200, which sounds slow by today's numbers, but DDR4 3200 with tight timings, it might take some additional tuning for it to work successfully on a board like this. We ran 2 sets of benchmarks, doubled the time, and we did 2 of the 8GB normal sticks we use, so we get all the timings controlled, and then we did 2 higher capacity sticks at 16GB each. That way we could have a 32GB combination. That was 3200 CL16, so a little bit looser on the timings, but it allows us to get some additional data for higher capacity, which is important for production tests. We'll start with CSGO at 1080p. The 12700H on our Mini-ITX motherboard came in at 296 FPS average with lows proportional to neighboring results on the chart. The closest cost retail CPU from Intel with the motherboard cost factored in would be the 13400F. We have data on the 12100F, which shares P-core architecture with the 13400F and remains a great value for entry-level builds despite the quad-core nature. The 12100F ran at 255 FPS average, allowing a 16% lead to the 12700H on the Erying board. It's actually not a bad start. In our previous data, the 13400F was 11% faster than the 12100F, and that scaling is consistent here if we were to rerun it. We just haven't rerun it this year. The 5900X is 16% faster than the 12700H in this test. For reference, the previous data would establish the 5600 has about 6% faster than the 12700H via extrapolation. In CSGO, the Erying board with the 12700H competes in line with nearest price retail alternatives. To represent CPU load on a modern title, we'll check out Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p next. The Erying results are varied depending on the memory kit, but overall are near to each other. It's about a 5% difference. Lows for the 12700H are a little worse than surrounding entries on the chart, which indicate more frequent or more noticeable differences in frame-to-frame consistency. Most other CPUs on the chart outperform the 12700H's 148 FPS average, with the 5900X, for example, at 29% faster, and even the 12100F at 6% faster. So it's not as good of a showing as in CSGO, but we're still well into playable territory. As a previous reference, the 13400F would, if retested, be approximately at a 13% lead over the 12700H's 32GB results based on our prior data. The 5600 would still maintain a strong lead of roughly 25% over the 12700H. This is a measure of the amount of time it takes to compile Chromium from a source, so lower is better. The Erying 12700H finished the job in 82 minutes, tying the R5 7600X. The extra E-cores of the 12th gen mobile CPU are pulling their weight here. Predictably, it outperforms the quad-core 12100F in this highly threaded workload. The 13400F would run slower than the 12700H here based on prior data as well. This result is more positive for the Erying configuration than the last one. A lot of that has to do with Intel's architecture with compiling specific workloads. This represents a mixed workload. It needs both single-thread speed and multi-thread power to do well. Our 12700H with 32 gigabytes scored 1135 points in aggregate using the combinatory suite from Puget, and that makes for a 12% lead over the 16 gigabyte run. It's another validation that RAM quantity can have an effect on certain workloads, like this one. And in this case, that's because the extra RAM is reducing the hits to the scratch disk. The lead over the 12100F isn't as large as it was in Chromium, with the 12700H scoring a 13% increase or advantage over it. The 13400F, if retested, would be around 1342 points this time, which would be an 18% advantage over the 12700H. Compared to AMD, the Erying 12700H falls well short of the 7600X and gives up an 8% lead to the 5900X. Grave digging the 5600 from old data gives us around 1071 points, which would have the 32 gigabyte 12700H configuration at 6% faster. Now back to the malware we talked about earlier. One downside to going with lesser known or poorly established brands like Erying is that it's hard to have the same level of confidence in the integrity of the company's internal practices, their IT and security systems, and what they have on their website. It would likely be a lot easier for an attacker or an insider to host malware on the company website and to shove it into source code somewhere. We ran into this during the making of this piece when we went to download all the drivers for the 11th gen board, the one that's, as you noticed, not in these charts, and that was when we were downloading the drivers from their own website. Windows Defender immediately flagged and stopped the download for the HID driver listed here. We immediately checked what Defender said about the file, and according to the report, it contained a Trojan called Whack Attack that can give an attacker remote execution privileges on your PC. It's about one of the worst possible things to happen. Now, fortunately, that's quarantined from anything that really matters on our network. And yes, we did do additional inspection and scans on the machine where we downloaded it, and it's all fine, and once again is isolated from anything important or critical. But this is a major point that all of us often overlook when installing drivers, which give all kinds of access. Even MSI, for instance, recently released its own memo on exercising caution with its own drivers when from third parties, and they're far more established than Erying, but maybe not much more protected. Gigabyte's been hacked plenty of times recently too, and their drivers have also been a risk in the past. Like we said earlier, we're not in a position to definitively say whether that was actually a Trojan or a false positive from Defender. That's not our jobs here. We don't have the authority on it, and we're not really here to find out. That one package was the only one that got flagged for anything, but we'd advise downloading from first-party sources where possible, which we did here. But when downloading files from random board vendors like this one, it may be best to do it in an isolated or a sandboxed VM environment, or in the very least, remain a little bit more aware about the potential risks. Purely physically, these are pretty interesting products. I mean, soldering a CPU to a board, obviously not a new idea. That's why these CPUs were made to begin with. And while there's no chipset to salvage because these are SoCs, the point is that these parts, the CPUs specifically, the SoCs, are being used in a way that is not typical of them. You can find them in mini PCs for sure. This is especially true for AMD Ryzen stuff, where you'll find basically a laptop component in a mini PC to compact it as much as possible, throw away some of the socketability and replaceability of it in exchange for getting something maybe VESA mountable to the back of a monitor. In this case, same type of idea, taking the smallest possible part, but in this case also probably one of the cheapest combinations, especially for the region that it's primarily being sold in, and strapping it to a cool board. So that's interesting. Now, the thing that we are the most concerned about is that malware flag. We don't want to hinge too hard on that just because, again, kind of general disclosure of our limitations. We're always very upfront about the things we're limited on, and one of them is definitely security relating to things like malware, because it's not something any of us really do. That was this one. That was the 11980HK board. The Mini-ITX 12700H one that we actually tested did not seem to throw any similar issues, and as we mentioned earlier, these systems, we don't log into important accounts on them, and they're relatively quarantined. So if you are going to explore with one, you get a flag about malware, in the very least, build some kind of isolation chamber with a sandboxed VM or something. As for the rest of the board, the 12700H performance is hit and miss. It's a little inconsistent. we are throwing a mobile CPU at a desktop test suite. But even with that, most of these applications, they're not abnormal for a laptop CPU to be doing. And Photoshop's pretty normal. Code compile. A lot of developers use laptops these days, and then some gaming. So sometimes it was really good, like in CSGO, and sometimes it's just not a clear victory. You'd be better off with a cheap desktop set of parts. The other CPU SKUs look better for value. So the Mini-ITX one that we have, being about $320 for 12700H and a board with all the I/O that you have, which actually is a ton. 4 display outs that all work simultaneously, and 2 Ethernet ports, 3 M.2, got a lot of USB. It's really compact, good set of hardware for pretty cheap. But the $135 options, especially with those engineering chips, those start to look like good value. It's just now you're playing with engineering chips, and sometimes they have really weird quirks that the manufacturers may not be aware of, because those are not legitimately sourced. They are either purchased from sort of harvesters who are sourcing and selling former Intel components and their partners' components. So ES chips, engineering samples, end up with board manufacturers. They end up with server companies, and eventually they all get dumped. And that's where they get bought up by companies like Erying and harvested and repurposed. And we actually don't have a problem with that. So even if it's kind of like an illegitimate or unlicensed acquisition of the ES parts, it's way better than just ending up in a landfill. So it's a cool use. It's just there will be some peculiar issues with them. It's a novel idea. The construction is very well executed here. The BIOS is functional. It's rough around the edges. Updates may fix it. The company seems very straightforward and honest with the marketing that we saw, assuming the malware issue is not first party, of course. We have no reason to suspect that it is, but it's something, it's worth mentioning at this point, because there's no established trust here in this particular brand. They're new to us, so that has to be earned over time. But anyway, pretty cool piece of hardware and fun to play around with. Could be very useful in extremely tiny builds. Let us know if you're going to use it for something and what that build is in the comments below. Thanks as always for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, or patreon.com/gamersnexus for bonus videos and posts. And we'll see you all next time.